Okay. So I actually spent some time this afternoon doing something I haven't done for quite a long time, and that was scanning YouTube and just sort of having a bit of a listen, bit of a scope about for what's out there, kind of non-duality wise. And of course, there are more people sort of coming forwards and talking about non-duality but it also means I think this sort of communication has got more of a presence online now. And I did talk about a little bit sort of briefly in a meeting about how it's almost like the word or the words, the lingo, the language with this type of communication when describing the concepts has sort of become a bit more apparent, and more people seem to be using it. And but then, of course, there are also more and more online responses to this type of communication as well. And I mean, first of all, I would say that this type of communication will never be popular. It just isn't popular and will never be popular because it just doesn't offer anything. But what I would also say is there's absolutely no authority here. And I've said this before, I'm sure, many times. This is not in some kind of special place that you have to get to. In fact, that's the antithesis of what's being suggested here. What's being suggested here is that this is already the aliveness, the fullness, the everythingness that's longed for, that the seeker feels is somehow missing about this. And that's just simply it. The suggestion is it's just already here, but just as an appearance. And this is a thing, and there's, obviously lots of it's words like appearance that seem to be, there seems to be a lot of contention around the use of using the word appearance and things like that. And I would say that the words are used to try and describe, in a way, what's being pointed to. And some words come closer. And I would say that there are some words which are going to create probably less confusion when we are sort of articulating and sort of describing the concepts or trying to give an impression of what we're talking about when this is being spoken about in that way. And I think when there is a clear communication, there's usually less of that, and it usually tends to be simpler and more direct. And I think that's what some people just don't like, because the individual, it wants to have something to do. It wants the mind of the individual just loves to have something to engage with in some way. It wants to have something to do. So it wants to take this and do something with it and put it somewhere. And that almost seems to be the sort of the automatic functioning of the mind, in a way. The individual mind is this sort of constantly trying to work everything out. What do I do? It's this sort of survival type mechanism that the individual seems to employ as a way to sort of try and survive. But it's almost as though the mind of the individual can only really see what's being said here or shared here in absolutes, because it lives in that world of duality, or that apparent world of duality. So it'll hear a term like empty fullness, and I can't think of a better word to describe what appears as being seemingly empty, but also seemingly full, other than to call it empty fullness. I can't think of better words. If I do, perhaps I'll start using them. But the mind will hear empty fullness, and it will begin to, it will sort of think that emptiness is as a negative and fullness as a positive. And it sort of has to do that seemingly with the communication. So very often the response to this communication, when the me responds to this and the individual responds to this type of communication, either in a positive or a negative way, it's usually because the mind has turned it into a story of some kind to make it kind of fit what the individual thinks it already knows. But also it can be like a positive or a negative, you know, which is quite apparent on YouTube. There are clearly some seekers or people who listen to this and enjoy this type of communication and think it's wonderful. And to that, I would say it isn't. You clearly haven't heard what's being said. And there are some people that hear this and think it's awful and it's harmful and it's damaging. And I would say to that also, it isn't. But the mind will just seemingly put it in. It has to do something with it and put it in a box somewhere. It has to pigeonhole it as something. And that's what seemingly happens when there is all this whole conversation about, you know, non-duality and what's the right message and what's the wrong message and so on and so forth. And, you know, why do speakers speak about non-duality and, you know, all this kind of thing. And how the mind wanders is all I will say to that, and how the mind comes up with all sorts of wonderful reasons for why that may be, of course. And yeah, I would say that the message, the communication is completely neutral. So that doesn't mean that the person sharing, or the communicator rather, is in a position of neutrality necessarily. It's just that there is no positive, negative, good, bad, right, wrong appearing in the way that it does for the individual in the story. And there's just no charge to the communication at all. There isn't a, it's not meant as a positive and it's not meant as a negative, because what apparently happens with the message is a pointing to what is already, as already being this wholeness, this aliveness, this nothing being everything, empty fullness already. So in that sense, there is just no authority. There is no suggestion as to what one should or shouldn't do, should be listening to, shouldn't be listening to, should stop listening to, should start listening to. And there is certainly no one telling anyone else what they should or shouldn't be doing with their apparent life. This is just simply a report. It's descriptive, and it's just simply a report of what becomes or is apparent when the seeking ends, when there is just no longer a seeker or an individual. Which is impossible to do, I might add. It's impossible to put this into any kind of context that the individual is going to understand, or that the mind can sort of do something with. It's just impossible, because it is everything which is equally nothing. It's fullness, abundance, fullness, which is also absolutely empty. How do you put that into words? How do you describe that in a way that the mind of the individual, which seemingly lives in this world of absolutes, it is or it isn't? How can that possibly be put into some kind of context that could be in any way understood? So sometimes when it's said that what's being shared here is beyond the mind, it just means that the mind can't get it. It's just the mind can't grasp it, because it is neither a positive or a negative. It is neither right nor wrong. It's neither a truth nor is it false or a lie or bullshit. So the mind doesn't know what to do with it, which creates the confusion and the don't know what to do with it and the frustration. And that's not an intention to do so. It's just how it seemingly comes across, because it's just nothing appearing as everything, sharing, nothing appearing as everything. So it's neither a positive nor a negative, and it's neither a good nor a bad. It's neither a true nor a false. It's not right or wrong. And there is absolutely no authority and no one telling anyone, in inverted commas, what they should or shouldn't be doing with one's life, or what should be happening or what shouldn't be happening. It's just purely descriptive in a way. Okay, message already. Fullness can be grasped. Please say more about emptiness. Well, the mind can work with empty or it can work with full, because it seemingly lives in this world of absolutes, or this sort of apparent duality where something is either full or empty. It can't do anything with empty fullness, which this seemingly is. It is empty as being full, fullness as being empty, simultaneously, not two things being one thing together. They are both the same thing, which is completely ungraspable. And I would also say to that, the individual has no idea what fullness is. Because for the individual, fullness is good. I feel good. I don't feel like I need anything today. I feel calm, or I feel, however that particular individual imagines it should be, how it should be in order for this to be fullness, full, okay. It's got no idea. The individual, it cannot help but be in this apparent, limited, contracted state. That just seems to be energetically the nature of that, of the individual. Just seems to just energetically be this contracted, limited energy. So it can only use what it knows, or what is its experience, to try and decode what's being shared, or to try and put what's being shared into some kind of a context. And that's where all the misunderstandings come from. The misunderstandings come out of the need for the mind to have an understanding about this. And it is only the individual that needs to understand the message. Because as I've said before, when the individual, the apparent individual, apparently dies, then there is no message. It's just the end of the conversation entirely.
Hi, Neil.
Hello.
Yeah, I asked that question about the empty, if you could. So,
yeah, hi. Was that
so
a typo, or did you mean that fullness can be grasped or can't be grasped?
No, I thought that fullness can be grasped, because I was thinking of it in terms of appearances. What is appearing? You know, everything is appearing, everything is full, in other words. And
Oh, you've
but,
muted
but
yourself. Oh, there you are.
I meant to turn my camera on. But the way you explained it, it seemed that it was less to do with appearances. It was more to do with the experience of the for want of a better word, the so-called individual. I think you were describing the state of being an individual is empty fullness, when I thought you were describing what's arising as empty fullness.
Oh, no, well, perhaps I didn't speak clearly. The individual can't work with empty fullness, empty being fullness, and fullness also being empty, as being the same thing, which this is. It's empty fullness. And so the mind, the individual can't work with that.
Yeah,
the individual might be able to work with sort of either absolute with there, like, okay, the goal is emptiness. Certainly when I was a seeker, there was a meditation that I used to do about emptying the mind. So I'm trying to go for this emptiness. So there's an idea of what this emptiness could be.
Mm.
You know, so the mind engages and the individual will sort of get some kind of idea of that. And then also the fullness. Well, I'm going to make my life as full as I possibly can by going out and doing lots of things and having lots of experiences. And the suggestion that this is empty fullness is it's neither that nor the other. It's everything. It's all of it. And it just seems to be the automatic functioning of the mind of the individual to have to do something with the communication. So when it hears empty fullness, it has to think about there's this one thing, seemingly, one thing that is empty, and then there's this other thing that is fullness. And maybe they are coming both together in some way. But no, they are the same thing, which is just completely ungraspable.
Mm.
Because to think of empty fullness, which is the same as saying real and unreal. And
yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression from your question is that when you're saying that the individual can grasp fullness, is maybe you're thinking of that as realness. The individual can see this as being something real, as in it's a real something that's here.
Yeah.
And yes, I would agree that can be seemingly the experience for the individual. But what is here is actually just an empty appearance. For the individual, it seems to be real and seems to be something solid. And it's not that it's not something solid, but it's not that it is either. It's real and unreal, or you could equally say it's neither real nor unreal. It's just apparent. And it really does seem that for the individual, that it just, everything just sort of has a place. It has a thingness to it. And that's quite startling when the whole, the whole veil of thingness apparently drops, and there is just no thingness. But again, appearing as everything is no thingness, and that's the adventure.
Yeah, trying to get this head round it because it would be nice to understand the concepts, and I'm imagining that emptiness is the ground from which everything is appearing.
Well, everything is emptiness. So it's not like everything is appearing from emptiness, or that in the beginning there is emptiness that then becomes this fullness. It is the same thing. I know I've quoted him before, but there's a guy called Robin Kirkus who he did a few talks, I think, or he did a film, and he put it wonderfully. I don't know if he's a scientist, but he seemed to have a good sort of conceptual grasp of physics and things like that. But he described it as the emptiness that was here before the Big Bang is still here. And I just thought that was a wonderful way to describe it. That the emptiness that is apparently before all things is still all things. It doesn't become everything. The emptiness is the everythingness.
Yeah. And if there is really no time, and everything is manifesting, then you could say that it's manifesting out of emptiness.
I wouldn't say that this is manifesting. I would say it is what appears already. There's nothing really actually arising or manifesting in that sense. It's just what appears as being already everything, or everything that is and isn't.
I think I was using the word manifesting to describe just being. Everything is being.
Okay. And what I was going to say is it really isn't about understanding the concepts. Again, sort of going back to what I was trying to sort of articulate at the beginning, it isn't about understanding concepts necessarily, because what the mind will do with concepts, it will say, well, it is something or it isn't something, or I don't know what that is, so I'm just going to reject that and leave it alone. But, oh, I like this concept, I'll work with that. It just seems to be what automatically happens when all of that's going on.
Yeah.
And the mind just loves that, you know, it just loves to be entertained in that way and get into all of those things. And of course, the mind will think it is about understanding the concept. And it really isn't about an understanding of the concepts. The concepts or the words may, as I said earlier, may give more of it, can give more of an impression or less of an impression, I think, of what we're talking about. But they can also, I think, in some way, just sort of, there can be a sort of an unraveling of misunderstandings as well.
Because you would say that you don't understand anything. I would say you seem to have an understanding of concepts, but you would say to me that you don't understand anything.
Well, no, not necessarily. The concepts can be understood, but it isn't what we're talking about isn't the concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Or equally, the concepts aren't describing what we're talking about. So of course, this brain, if you like, has an understanding of the concepts, otherwise it wouldn't be able to talk about them.
Mm.
But it isn't the concepts. The communication isn't the concepts. It isn't the words. It isn't the words empty fullness. What that's attempting to point to is that this is empty fullness.
Mm.
What you're sitting on is empty fullness.
So the communication is just the finger pointing to something.
No, because it's also the finger, because that would be saying it is something and not something else. It would be saying it's not the finger, it's what the finger points to. I'm aware of the old Zen koan pointing to the moon.
Mm.
No, it is everything. All of it, everything that is appearing. So there can't be a pointing to non-duality, let's say, because it isn't a something, and it isn't something that can be understood. But we could also equally say non-duality is everything. Everything is this not two-ness. So it would be the pointing and what's being pointed to. Again, empty and fullness, empty fullness. No thing, everythinging.
Just the empty, which is less easy to understand.
Well, it's impossible to understand. I'll help you out. It's impossible to understand.
Yes.
It's just completely ungraspable. And what can seemingly happen is that which one needs to kind of know, understand, or that which is trying to grasp for this can just sort of energetically melt away. And it's just then obvious. It's just empty fullness. It's all those words I heard people describing in meetings. It was all of those, but then also it was none of those. Can't put words to this. Can't be described. Okay, thanks, Freddie.
Thank you.
And next question in the chat. When there is hearing a sound, for example, what about the sounds that I do not hear but exist in a certain room? What is called attention? I am confused about that when talking about everything. So the illusion is that there is someone hearing a sound. So whether there's a sound happening in a room, in this room here that you can see in the screen, whether there's a sound happening in this room or in a room 3 miles away, there is still no one hearing that or experiencing that sound. But what the me thinks is if it spends time paying attention to sounds, or just being more present to sounds, of course, then it will be a more happy, sort of content, fuller me. So when we say everything's apparently here, as in everything is just what appears to be here. And another comment in the chat or question: isn't it strange that the individual is listening to this message as the mind can't understand it? The individual is not listening to this message. The apparent individual, of course, it's not listening to this message. It doesn't want to hear this message. In fact, as I was trying to get across earlier, the mind, the individual, is constantly rejecting the message by turning it into a story of some kind. It's either this or it's that. It's not that it is about this, it isn't about this. It's true, it's not true, it's right, it's wrong. You know, it's great, it's rubbish. It's constantly just going through that all of the time. And so it's constantly rejecting the communication in that way. But if it's heard, it's an energetic resonance. It's nothing to do with the mind or the individual hearing the message. It's something energetic that just sort of in some way senses what's being shared or what's being communicated or what's being pointed to. Something kinda, knowing isn't the right word, but something kind of knows that this is empty fullness. It's not knowing the individual, it's not experienceable. It can't be known as an experience, but something senses, resonates. That's a safer word to use. That resonance is something just recognizes in the communication the empty fullness or the aliveness or home. Sensing home in the communication, but not the individual. It's not what the individual wants to talk. The individual wants to go on YouTube and talk about opinions it has about different speakers and what they're talking about and all that lovely stuff. And a message: hi Neil, I'm new to your meetings. Can you speak of when the veil of individuality fell away in your case? Was it sudden or gradual? Well, the apparent energetic shift from a sort of contractedness into a boundlessness happened quite suddenly here, or seemed to, certainly, but it wasn't all over in one go. It's sort of, there were bits left, shall we say. This is a story. We can only talk about this as a story. There were bits left, but it seemed quite sudden. Yeah, it was a bit of a shock to the system. But of course, it isn't a me or an individual falling away. It's this sort of apparent contractedness. The me sort of lives as this apparent contractedness, which can just suddenly just melt into boundlessness. Or the everythingness, the no-thingness. The something can apparently melt into the no-thingness, and then what's recognized is that no-thing is already everything. And that's just how it naturally is and has always been. So of course there is no real veil of separation to drop or to fall away, because there just is no separation in the first place. Just a comment: me and the Father are one, Jesus. out of this sentence arises a lot of misunderstandings. The individual, oh Father, the individual, oh Father, that have something to do with family ties and so on. Yes. But then again, the individual, the mind can only think of there is the Son and the Father, and they are existing as one thing. That's just, it's not the case. It's that to use that terminology, the Father and the Son aren't separate. Just to purely use the terminology from the quote that you used, because I understand the symbolism of what I think that's meaning. Yeah, and that the Son comes from the Father. Yeah, all those sorts of misunderstandings could come out of that. Yeah. So who knows what Jesus said, whether he existed or not, and whether he said that or not, what he meant by that. But in the context of what we're talking about, it's just that the Son and the Father aren't separate. The nothing and the everything aren't separate. The emptiness and the fullness aren't separate. They are the same. And another comment, a thing is a description, an illusion. There are no things. The only illusion is that there is an individual. The individual, the me, is the only illusion. Part of what appears for the illusion is that there are things, because that is how it experiences itself. And the duality really isn't the separation of apparent things, because there isn't any. For the individual, for the illusion, it's that I am something here and there is everything else that isn't here. That's the apparent separation for the individual, but it is the individual that's the illusion. It's not that apparent things are an illusion, or that the appearance, the world, is an illusion. No, it's the illusion is that there is an individual, a separate self. That's the illusion.
Hey, Neil.
Hello.
Hey, good to see your appearance.
Hey, man. How you doing?
Great, great, great. I was wondering if dreaming still appears there, and if it has any different flavors before absence seemed to take place.
Yeah, I just, there's just no remembering of dreams really anymore. I mean, occasionally there might be, because you know, this is getting older, so it does have to get up once or twice in a night now. And there may be, you know, it's apparent that there was dreaming happening, but it's just not remembered. I don't know. I mean, it's just
yeah.
you know, I think that maybe, you know, if the individual thinks, as with everything else that it experiences, that its dreams are important in some way, or that dreams are messages, and no, I don't think so. No, dreaming apparently happens, but you know, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if they had a different flavor, kind of like some speakers will say this is a dream. So the only difference is whenever the individual dissolves, is they, you know, that certainty doesn't change. So that it's always a everything, nothing. So they're not kind of caught off by the duality, so to say. Versus, I was just wondering, after absence takes place, which doesn't take place, but if the dream has a different flavor, or in the dream if it still goes into duality after absence. In other words, right now there's no one that can convince you duality is here.
Mm.
You wouldn't fall for it. Versus, I was just wondering in the dream, but it doesn't sound like you remember your dreams, if that's shifted at all, or if in the night dream state, if duality seems to appear there, whereas it does not appear during this daydream. If that makes any sense.
No, all I could say to that is no. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next thing I was going to ask is, there was a funny statement that Nisargadatta made, and it stayed with me for all these years. And there was a guy asking him a question, Michael, I think was his name. So Michael was asking Nisargadatta about Ramana Maharshi, the self-inquiry. Okay. So the response Nisargadatta gave, which was an odd response, it's probably why it stuck, is he, answer was very strange. He said, the space named Michael is asking the space named Nisargadatta about the space named Ramana Maharshi.
Mm.
That was the response.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so it just kind of throws you off, so this would be pretty much the equivalent. The space here is talking to the space there, or the emptiness, fullness.
No.
Or
a space can only exist when there is some sort of boundary around that space which would define that as being a space. No, there isn't a space here as defined by something, and then a space there as defined by something, and then a space there as defined by something. That's very much, I have to say, in the flavor of the awareness teachings, whereas, the true you, the I am that you truly are, is the space within which all of this arises. Your awareness, your consciousness. No, and I would say that that's still the illusion, that there is someone who could possibly know themselves as being a space within which this arises, or could possibly know themselves as being consciousness. And what I would say to Nisargadatta is, there is nothing that I am.
Great. Okay, that sounds wonderful.
I am is the illusion.
So to even be aware of space, even though no one really knows even what that is, as with any concept, that still implies awareness. So,
well, space as relative to what? There's just the infinite.
The infinite space, yeah.
Well, again, a space would have to be defined by something. It's just not, it's indefinable. You just can't do that. It's edgeless, seamless. There's no centers, there's no edges. It is the infinite. It's the absolute, it's the infinite, what appears. So when I say it's all of it, that's kind of what's meant. It's the absolute, in the sense that there is nothing else. There isn't somewhere else or something else. There isn't a space appearing here and then a space appearing over there.
Okay.
This is spaceless. It's timeless and spaceless.
And one more, since I don't see any hands up. Well, can't really see on this phone, but
yeah, go for it.
The last thing is, let's just some imagination. Let's just say I went to England and we had a bunch of drinks. Even though I get a headache when I drink, so I wouldn't have a bunch of drinks. But we took a bunch of funny mushrooms or whatever. Over here, there'd be experiencing of unicorns and aliens and all kinds of bizarre stuff. Over there, would that there's no experience there, but is it possible that would still arise, just like any other appearance?
I don't think so, no, but what you're implying is that would infer a separation, that it's sort of like the same thing as saying that this body can't know what that body is thinking, therefore that implies that this body is separate to that body. And as the appearance, then this body isn't that body, but the separateness, the separation, the illusion of separation only arises as there being an individual having an experience of what's happening in this body, and then an individual having an experience of what's happening in that body. And that would imply that there is a center here and a center there having two different experiences. That's the apparent separation. When there is no one, there is nothing having an experience of what's happening as this body, and therefore no one having an experience of what's happening in another body. And the dream or the illusion is that there is something in that body having an experience of what's happening in that body. That's the dream, that's the illusion.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Neil.
Okay, thanks, man. And a question in the chat, can it be escapism to come to this meetings? Well, for the individual, it might be, yes. Yeah. Yeah. But I think the individuals will look for and apparently find escapism in anything that it may or may not enjoy doing. I don't think that's unique to this meeting or any other meeting or any sort of teaching, whatever the case may be. The individual's always looking to escape, I think. Escape its reality for a bit, for a time. I think that's why sort of drugs and substances are so appealing to the individual. Or the individual wants to kind of have experience some kind of altered state, you know, whether through substances or meditation or something like that. Anything that's not this or something that's better than this. And that's the apparent dilemma for the seeker or for the individual. It's the constant rejection of what is already for something better in some imaginary future. Somewhere over there, I'm going to find something better. There is just this. And this isn't going anywhere, and it hasn't come from anywhere. So it's impossible for there to be an enlightenment somewhere else, or a liberation or an awakening somewhere else. Or a better. There's just this. Just going back to what we were talking about earlier, the mind of the individual is constantly trying to work this out as a way to try and avoid death, as a way to try and avoid dying, as a way to try and avoid what is already. Doesn't want to know anything about that. So it will engage with ideas and concepts and checklists. And I even found earlier this afternoon a checklist that one can do to find out if they're enlightened or not. And I don't know how many people have done it or who cheated or not. I have no idea. But who would want to be enlightened? Gosh, I wouldn't. Oh, message. But the individual is not choosing to escape. That is just happening. Yeah, well, there is no individual to escape. Yeah, of course. Another thing that comes up about this communication is bypassing quite often. Because again, the individual can only imagine that what's being talked about is someone who has in some way detached from life as being, or seeing life as a reality in some way, or someone who is just no longer seeing life as being something real. And of course, that's not the suggestion. The suggestion is this is already aliveness, life appearing for no one. And that includes everything that apparently goes on in life, everything that's apparently happening in wherever, for whomever, or as whatever. That's it. That's home. No, and of course, there's no one choosing to come to this meeting or to not come to this meeting, or to accept what's being, pardon me, what's being shared, or to reject what's being shared. It doesn't even matter. There is no message in the end. It's just no. There's no pointing to the moon. There's no pointing to something because there's nothing missing. Is that someone coming in? No, okay. There's a comment in the chat, loving that we're home already. Well, we're not. This is home already. There's nothing that isn't home, including an apparent individual who may be living in the experience that home is somewhere else.
So everything about the individual is an illusion.
The individual, that there is an individual is the illusion. The illusion of the individual only appears to the illusion of the individual, or the illusion only appears for the illusion. So it's only from within the illusion that the illusion seems to be a something that's real. But the illusion is that there is an individual. There isn't an individual appearing as an illusion.
So is everything about the individual an illusion?
Of course, there is no individual, yeah.
Right.
The experience that there is an individual is the illusion. Or it is that's an illusory experience, you could say, be a better way to say it. And I think we talked about this, didn't we? The nature, the term illusion is meant as in the nature of illusion is something that seems to create a misleading impression of reality, or a misleading impression of something that appears but actually isn't real.
But that's why you said that we're not home already, because there is no individual.
Well, yes, and there's no we to be home. Yes, of course, yeah.
But home is.
Well, home is all there
Oh.
is. But again, you know, if we really wanted to, we could pick apart the word home, because there's no one who's left home. So what would know this as being home if there was nothing that ever leaves home? What would know, who or what would know nirvana if nirvana's never left? There's just no way to really call this anything like that. Home, nirvana, whatever, empty fullness. They're all just words or terms which can be used to just in some way illustrate what's being shared or give an impression of what's being shared, but it can't. It's everything. Oh, thank you. Another question. Would you describe the individual a kind of energy? Yes, it seems to be. Well, the story goes, clear my throat, let me begin. Are we all sitting comfortably? The story goes or begins that there is this apparent arising of this sort of contractedness, a contracted energy out of which in the human, out of which, or in the body, out of which seems to arise this whole sense of the individual, or this whole kind of impression of there being an individual, a personal identity, all of the belief systems, all of that all seemingly sort of comes out of this initial sort of contracted energy. So this sort of contraction seems to be the beginning, if you like, of the individual. It's a knowing appearing in this sort of contractedness. And the first thing that's known is here as the impression or the sense of a position or as a location. And it's almost then as that sort of, as the body and the physiology responds to this sort of contracted energy, and then this whole sort of personal story then begins to kind of form in a way around that contractedness in a way. And what seemingly happens, or what can seemingly happen, is that just this contractedness, which isn't separate, by the way, it isn't separation, that is boundless energy, that's unconditionally wild and free energy appearing as a contracted, limited form. What can happen is that can just seemingly melt away, and then really the whole sense of the person seems to melt away with this contraction, and then the whole sort of personal identity has really got nowhere to be anymore, and it just the whole setup, really, the whole structure, the apparent structure, just seems to come down really at that point. So everything is energetic in that sense.
So, Neil,
Yeah.
when you say that the individual is an illusion, are you referring to the infant, which then develops the contraction? Are you talking about the whole of, you know, the body as well as the belief system?
Well, really, when you break it down, what we're really talking about is this sort of tension, this contracted energy. And the sort of the body and or the physiology sort of responds to that, and part of which seems to be to create this whole sort of sense of a personal identity around that. That whole thing is illusory because that sort of contractedness seems to create the impression of a position or of a location, whereas in actuality, there are no positions and there is no location. But it just sort of seems to create an impression of that. But that whole thing is illusory. There isn't actually a position with that apparent tension or contractedness.
Yeah, I understand that. But when you said that the individual was illusory, I took it that you meant that physical bodies are illusory.
No, we've had this conversation before. So when we're talking about an individual here, just to sort of explain what's meant by that, is we're talking about this sense to be someone. So it's sort of an energetic sense that there's someone here, you know, I'm here, seem to be, you know, this is me in the body or moving the body or as the body. I'm here, I'm having thoughts, I'm having experiences, I'm drinking a drink. It seems to become the whole sort of reality for the individual. Clearly, there's an apparent body left when there is no individual.
Right. So it's not so much the body that is illusory, it's the sense of the separate self, the me, the I.
It is just the I, the me, the individual that is illusory. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand that.
Okay. That won't help. Okay. Unless there's anyone who would like to come in and ask anything before we stop.
Awesome meeting you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Let's stop the recording now.